Hello. Well, we're back now for chapter two, and chapter two is really like the heart of the whole course, actually, because it's looking at the main and central concept, which is the concept of culture. And as you read in that chapter, the cultural anthropological focus on culture is extremely broad, and the notion of studying the whole way of life of a people is particular to cultural anthropologists, in distinction to, say, sociologists or a cultural sociologist like myself, in which we tend to answer a more focused, limited questions about a cultural field or cultural questions we may have about a group of people, for example. And our study will be focused on that, answering that specific question. For example, I have here my textbook that I spoke to you earlier online, Native Americans in the Carolina borderlands. And in my dissertation research, and this is the text that came from my dissertation research. I'm focused mainly on, unlike a culture, though a cultural anthropologist certainly, and more so today than ever, ask specific questions. If they're into an applied approach, they may be trying to find answers for a specific problem area for the culture and trying to find solutions for that problem. But in general, the general notion of studying the whole way of life of a people, for example, you would not find that in this study with the PD Native Americans in South Carolina. My main question, my main focus theoretically, was to focus on their problem with their identity. How does a group of people that define themselves as Native Americans and yet has no formal recognition as such, what are these strategies, cultural strategies that they use to represent themselves as Native Americans, and in such a way that makes it convincing to the jury, in a sense, that has to judge whether they're going to receive state recognition or federal recognition. So this is one area of study that I'm very interested in. But it's not the study of the whole way of life. To study the whole way of life would entail the true cultural anthropology, or anthropology in general, focus on the whole way of life. That would include, and you notice that in the chapters, how do these people make a living? What is their political system? What is their cultural traditions? What is their art forms, for example? How do they make their tools, their artifacts? Marriage in the family, how are the patterns of kinship within the family and across the society in general? So, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these questions go on, even as far as to talk about an interest in, excuse me, the human evolution, the evolution of human beings, and even before that, studying primate, right, the great apes, and studying their behaviors and how it may shed light on human behavior. So, the whole way of life of people is the definition that cultural anthropologists use. As I said, otherwise, or to give a better realistic sense, many cultural anthropologists today are doing research in areas that are very similar to what we are doing in sociology. My relationship is that methodologically and theoretically, I share across the discipline. It's interdisciplinary approach. Even though my degree is in sociology, it was interdisciplinary in the sense that my research was an ethnographic research. I was using theories as well as sociological, cultural anthropological theories in my dissertation. And I had a cultural anthropologist also on my committee. So in that sense, I consider myself actually a cultural sociologist. But it's a very thin line, actually. It's just a disciplinary boundary of people that are doing a lot of similar work. And we find this in a discipline called cultural studies, which is an interdisciplinary approach that includes various fields, including sociology and cultural anthropology. But with that said, as you study through this chapter, make sure that you focus on the various dimensions that the chapter focuses on in terms of characteristics of culture. So they talk about culture as being learned. We're not born with culture. It's something that we get from our enculturation into society. It's something we have to learn. Human behavior, for the most part, is learned behavior. Uh, Culture is symbolic, so it talks about our use of symbols and how it's somewhat unique to humans. There may be other species. There's still research going on whether or not other species may use any kinds of symbolic language at all. But even if so, human beings are way, way, way more complex in our ability to use symbolic language. You just have to take a short look. Just look at the what you're staring at right now. Not me, but about the computer in front of you is an example of how our symbolic communication makes possible the invention of something like the computer. I don't think we know of any species on this planet anyway that has created a computer or anything like that. But anyway, the chapter also talks about how we share culture. Through the sharing of culture makes possible human communication. It maps out the world for us in a sense so that we can share with others. Sometimes we get in trouble in other cultures because we don't understand the symbolic meanings. We don't understand the language. We don't understand the folkways and the mores of the norms of the group. Culture and nature, it talks about the relationship between culture and nature and how nature is culturally constructed for most human groups. It also talks about how culture is integrated with other spheres of social life. It also talks about culture being, for the most part, adaptive, but at times it can also be misadaptive or maladaptive and may cause us problems in society, as you'll see. And so I want you to look at each of those different characteristics of culture. And then also near the end of that chapter, they talk about the difference between ethnocentrism and cultural relativity. And as you will read there, ethnocentrism is when we tend to make judgment calls of other people's way of life in terms of our own cultural standards. And for cultural anthropology, that's a problem, even though it tends to be shared by all human groups. All human groups tend to be, to some extent, ethnocentric. It plays a positive functional role in creating a sense of we feeling among members of a group by having some outside group, for example, that they feel ethnocentric for. But what we try to instill in our students, and it's a must for being a cultural anthropologist, is cultural relativism. Just the notion that we can appreciate the cultural foundation of people's varying and differing ways of life, including culinary habits. We vary by the foods we eat, by the way we dress, by the way in which we interact with others, even in terms of the space, the tacit cultural aspect of learning culturally how far we should stand from each other when we're interacting with each other. Even that is part of cultural understanding. Even that's culturally relative. And I'll say some more about cultural relativism in my next section.